Je présente Sarah et je présente via la biographie qui est sur le site web de Équité culturelle. Sarah a une façon de penser différente. Elle est neuroatypique. Sarah a eu son diplôme de master en métiers et arts de l'exposition en France. Elle étudie au docteur en communication à l'UQAM, l'Université du Québec à Montréal. Sarah Heussaff fait des recherches sur les combats des personnes handicapées. Elle fait des recherches sur les arts qui donnent du pouvoir aux personnes handicapées. Sarah a des idées originales pour encourager l'exposition des arts faits par des personnes handicapées. Elle cherche comment organiser des expositions accessibles. En 2017, Sarah a organisé l'exposition Autonomous Spaces, espaces autonomes. L'exposition présentait des œuvres de personnes handicapées en France. Sarah a participé à des conférences et a publié des articles en France, au Canada et au Chili. Elle fait partie du centre de recherche Culture, Art, Société de l'UQAM. Elle fait aussi partie de l'Observatoire des médiations culturelles et du réseau handi-féministe. Voilà, et je laisse la parole à Sarah.
Merci pour cette présentation. Bonjour tout le monde. Merci beaucoup de m'avoir invité à Animée. Je suis très contente de rencontrer et de pouvoir assister à cette présentation ce matin. Donc on est très heureux et heureuse de vous accueillir ce matin dans les locaux du CELAT. Et donc heureux et heureuse d'accueillir également notre invitée Daniela Wentz pour une conférence sur son travail, Automata pour autistes, une histoire médiatique du behaviourisme des données. Et cette invitation se fait en partenariat donc avec le CELAT-UQAM et les chaires de recherche du Canada sur la citoyenneté culturelle des personnes sourdes et les pratiques en équité culturelle, dont Véro Leduc est la titulaire, et celle sur les médias, les handicaps et les auto-représentations, dont Mouloud Boukala, B-O-U-K-A-L-A, est le titulaire. Je vais donc commencer par une présentation très rapide, une petite biographie de notre invité, puis je vais laisser la place directement à Daniela Wentz pour sa conférence. Et ensuite, j'imagine qu'on va pouvoir procéder à un moment de questions et d'échanges. Donc la présentation se fait en anglais, mais les échanges pourront donc être en anglais et ou en français selon votre convenance et votre confort. Donc, Daniela Wentz est spécialiste des médias et actuellement postdoctorante dans le cadre du projet de recherche interdisciplinaire Interact, nouvelle forme de communication sociale avec des systèmes intelligents, à l'Université de Ruhr à Bochum en Allemagne. Et donc, elle travaille sur un projet concernant l'informatique affective et l'intelligence émotionnelle artificielle d'un point de vue historique et épistémologique des médias. Sans plus attendre, je laisse la place avec plaisir.
Merci beaucoup. Oui, je suis très émue aussi. Un grand merci pour votre accueil chaleureux et merci pour l'introduction. Et merci à vous d'être venus. Je suis très heureuse de votre intérêt dans mon travail. Je suis très embarrassée de ne pas pouvoir faire cette conférence en français. Ça fait presque 2 décennies maintenant que je n'ai pas parlé français d'une manière régulièrement, donc j'ai vraiment pas le courage de le faire. Mais comme l'a dit Sarah, vous pouvez me poser vos questions en français et je vais essayer de les répondre en français aussi. Donc voilà, je vais passer à la lingua franca académique maintenant. So before I start, the word on language use, I will mostly use identity first language rather than person first language when referring to individuals affected by autism. I acknowledge all the arguments that have been done for both of the users, but it's a political decision bringing to the fore my solidarity with the identity politics of the neurodiversity movement. And I also feel that I have to express a trigger warning. You might find the experiments I will present you today and also some of the material I'm going to show quite disturbing, and rightly so. I will present you a media history of the behavioral sciences, but it's at the same time a history of psychological violence. So yeah, I'm going to talk about a book project that I'm currently working on, in which, as I said, I'm trying to write a media history of neurodiversity, and my starting points are contemporary technologies that are used to diagnose and treat autism, for example, smart wearables or social robots that are used to assist or teach, especially autistic children, to read emotions and faces and to teach them interaction skills, social interaction skills. And I'm trying to trace those technologies back into the history of affective computing, the history of robotics, and also the history of the behavioral sciences and psychiatry, and also anti-psychiatry. So, and this, my media history of neurodiversity begins around 1800 with a media event, which is the story of Victor of Aveyron, a boy of about 12 at the time. He was found in a forest in southern France in 1797, where he had probably lived for several years without contact with society. Victor does not speak, shows few emotions, and apparently knows nothing about the customs of social interaction. In 1801, the young doctor Jean-Marc Itard, who had previously worked with deaf and hard of hearing people, took care of Victor and spent years of painstaking work trying to teach him imitation, speech, empathy, and social interaction with limited success. Itard's 2 reports in which he recorded his attempts and their results survived. And maybe you have heard of that story because there's a very famous movie by François Truffaut, L'Enfant Sauvage, with Truffaut as Itard, where he tells his take on this story of Itard and Victor. In 1984, Victor's education by Itard served already Sherry Turkle as the opener of her book, The Second Self, Computers and the Human Spirit. She sees Itard's experiment as a foreshadowing of 20th century research into machine intelligence and language, and that he asked himself how a blank mind, as she puts it, could nevertheless be enabled to develop speech and, as a result, social integration as a whole. What Victor was for Itard and his contemporaries is for Turkle in the present a computer, a new mind that is not yet a mind, as she writes. By the time of her statement, Turkle's analogy is almost a cliché, a parallelization of the autistic person and either machine, computer, or robot has run through the history of autism and computers ever since Hans Asperger in Austria and Leo Kanner in the US independently described a group of children and their behavioral anomalies in the 1940s and gave the phenomenon the term autism. However, Itard's efforts can also be read as the founding scenario of special education, and thus also as a harbinger of the systematic, meticulous attempts by applied behavioral research that began mid-century to teach autistic children speech, empathy, and social interaction skills, which I will discuss today. What can also be gleaned from Itard's descriptions of his attempts, his small successes, but above all his great failures, are the resistances he works against. Victor's manifested refusal to cooperate, to work together, his outbursts of anger. What I should point to here is a historiographical problem of my work, or rather one of its methodological challenges. How does one write the history of a phenomenon that, since its very first descriptions, has been addressed above all as a communicative void, a social blank space, to paraphrase Turkle, and which, for this very reason, has since then been attempted to be tackled through media technology? How can this succeed without reproducing the attempts to contour, stabilize, and classify it? Approaches that use marginalized perspectives as a category of analysis are confronted with gaps, with incomplete sources that need to be made productive, as approaches in disability, Black history, gender, and colonial history have shown. My approach consists, among other things, of an attempt to take seriously the media theoretical wisdom that media reveal themselves above all when they do not or no longer do what they are supposed to. Autistic children, especially non-verbal ones, usually appear as actors with their practices, if you will, as precisely such moments of disruption, for example, by undermining experimental arrangements and their logics. In these moments of friction, as I would like now like to show by presenting two case studies, two laboratory studies of early applied behavioral research of radical behaviorist origin, both the attempts to systematically produce or eliminate autism and the autistic children become visible as actors in history that primarily intended them as a test field. No.
Oups, je pense qu'il faut juste qu'on mette la flèche sur l'écran.
Machine gambling in Indianapolis. After Charles Ferster spent the first half of the 1950s working as a postdoc with B.F. Skinner at the Harvard Pigeons Lab and a further 2 years conditioning chimpanzees in Orange Park, Florida, he felt well prepared when he took up a professorship at the Institute of Psychiatric Research of Indiana University Medical Center in 1957. In this role, Ferster was among the pioneers in applying methodological approaches, theories, and conclusions derived from 2 decades of animal research to human experimental studies. Together with his colleague, Marion de Meyer, the director of the Research Center for Childhood Schizophrenia, he designed a large-scale experiment aimed at developing a technique for controlling the behavior of autistic children in an artificial environment with the goal of, I quote, expanding the children's limited behavioral repertoire, end of quote. The general experimental framework, to be stated at the outset, was entirely based on the theory and methods of operant conditioning that Skinner and himself had developed primarily through experiments with rats and pigeons, and was also highly reminiscent of the technical analytical apparatus used in this context, the so-called operant conditioning chamber, also known as the Skinner box. Developed by B.F. Skinner himself while he was still a graduate student, the operant conditioning chamber was the essential technological condition for his work and the subsequent development of the entire discipline of applied behavior analysis. Originally, the operant conditioning chamber was a minimalistic space with unadorned walls and limited stimuli. In this space, a small lever or backlit disc, depending on the species being studied, was positioned on one wall. Food was dispensed through a tube, which could be programmed to deliver food according to specific reinforcement schedules, such as one release after every third lever press, or one release following the first reaction after a 30-second delay. Ferster's and de Meyer's artificial environment was an experimental chamber that featured a variety of equipment rather than just one operandum. This room boasted an extensive array of devices that could be activated either through the insertion of a coin or by direct key pressing. These devices, which were added to the room step by step during the experiment, included a coin dispenser operated by key, a pinball machine, a color wheel giving a kaleidoscopic effect, a matching to sample device, a television set, a phonograph, an electric train, an 8-column candy vending machine with a separate light and coin slot in each column so that the child could choose the particular candy. A second 1-column vending machine to deliver small trinkets or small packages containing parts of the child's lunch. A telephone handset with music through the earpiece, an electric organ, a 35mm slide viewer, and as a special highlight, either a pigeon or a monkey behind a window trained with the operant conditioning techniques who would perform only when the compartments of the animals were lighted. The initial phase of the experiment involved introducing the children to a candy dispenser which could be activated by pressing a button. Later, all devices and machines had to be operated by inserting a coin, which could be earned by using the coin dispenser. The experiment in question, which involved leaving children alone in the artificial environment, focused on measuring the frequency of their interactions with the machines. Specifically, the study examined the rate at which the children pressed keys and deposited coins, while varying either the schedules of reinforcement and/or the conditions under which rewards would be delivered. For instance, the delivery of coins was contingent on every nth key press or the illumination of a light above the coin slot. The machine served as a positive reinforcement for the children's behavior, whereas the coins acted as a generalized reinforcer that could be used to operate any of the rewarding devices in the room. Förster and Meyer thus not only conducted the first operant conditioning tests on autistic children, but they also pioneered a process known as token economy, which has since been implemented in modern therapy tools and elsewhere as a means of tracking progress through rewards such as stars, points, badges, scores, and levels. The entire experiment lasted over a year with almost 300 experimental sessions for each of the children, at the end of which the researchers considered their thesis that the behavior of autistic children, despite their narrow perceptual and behavioral repertoire, could be brought under the control of the artificial environment to be confirmed, and reported that the children sometimes, I quote, perform almost continuously during the entire experimental session, with most of their behavior conforming to the requirements of the automatic environment. End of quote. They also state with visible pride, over 50,000 coins were delivered and 400,000 responses recorded for subject 1 alone. But how did they come to this conclusion? Curves. The experiment was programmed and recorded automatically using the automatic vending machines and electronic devices which were connected to electrical recorders. The authors do not specify the type of recording device they utilized in their study. Despite this, the multiple graphs that you can see here discussed in the articles on the experiment clearly indicates that they used so-called cumulative recorders, which are graphic recording devices that are connected to the machines and record the number of actuations as well as their chronological sequence in the form of a curve in real time. The cumulative recorder that you can see here on the side was developed by B.F. Skinner, again, who refined the device over several decades and brought it to commercialization. When used in the context of the Skinner box, the cumulative recorder is connected to the lever, key or picking disc, and records in real time both the number of lever actuations and picking behavior, as well as the temporal sequence and also the reinforcements. The machine was developed by Skinner from a device called chemograph, which was the first self-writing apparatus originally invented in the middle of the 19th century to measure blood pressure in animals. As the so-called Ludwigstrom, named after its inventor, the German physiologist Karl Ludwig, it quickly found its way into physiological and psychological laboratories worldwide, where it was used for various types of reaction measurements. Kenneth Littell, who has studied the history of the cumulative recorder, has estimated its significance for behavioral analysis at the highest level. I quote, "The history of the cumulative recorder was to early behavior analysis what the microscope was to early biologists." End of quote. This comparison does not seem unreasonable, given that the cumulative recorder made it possible, at least in the eyes of behavioral researchers, to study life in detail, in this case behavior and its relationship to environmental events. Oops, this is the chemograph I wanted to show you. The cumulative recorder not only records the behavior of interest, but also writes it down, makes it visible, and thus, first and foremost, analyzable. As such, the apparatus was nothing less than the technological and media condition of the behavioral sciences. However, this is not meant merely epistemic, for beyond the recording function, without which it would have been impossible to analyze the consequences of the various reinforcement schedules and their increasingly complex combinations, the resulting graphs, the cumulative records, also had a storage and representational function and hence also served the purpose of communication. In the acclaim for this technology and the appraisal of its historical significance, nearly all arguments that have been accompanied the use of graphic self-recorders since their invention in the 19th century are repeated almost without exception. Just as with its successor, the cumulative recorder, the chemograph had to keep pace epistemologically with the microscope. Hermann von Helmholtz and Etienne Jumaret anonymously referred to the self-recorders as microscopes of time. At the time of the chemograph, it was elevated, like the cumulative recorder for the behavioral sciences, to being the preeminent medium of not just one, but multiple disciplines. An obituary for Karl Ludwig in 1895 states, I quote, "As little as a cultural state is possible at the end of the century without the railroad, telegraph, and telephone, so little is physiological, pharmacological, and pathological research conceivable today without the graphic method. It is not too much to say that its introduction raised the moral level of physiology. For from then on, it was no longer enough to simply make an assertion. One demanded to see it documented with curves." End of quote. This quotation highlights that the production of scientific documents through mechanical means has always been, as we all know, associated with the greatest potential for objectivity and evidentiary support, as Lauren Deston and Peter Gallison have shown in detail. 100 years after the invention of the self-writer, it evokes the same expectations and promises. The effectiveness of the reinforcement schedules could be illustrated through the graphs. Experiments could be replicated, and moreover, these methods validated the research approach and its theoretical underpinnings. The methodology employed by Förster and Zermeier was entirely dependent on the cumulative recorder as the recording medium. This methodological choice determined the research question, its underlying assumptions, and the findings of the experiment. The only behaviors that can be measured using the experimental setup are the pressing of a button and insertion of a coin. These actions trigger an electrical contact, making both the automatic recording and algorithmization of the experiment possible. Nevertheless, a solitary instance of a keystroke has an insignificant impact, implying that it must be intentionally designed for recurrence, if not excessive repetition from the get-go, in order to generate graphical representations in the form of set curves. Between the descriptions of the different reinforcement plans and the analysis of the corresponding experimental procedures, Förster and Zermeier do not conceal the fact that they have to struggle with difficulties from time to time, often for weeks or even months. For example, the children often do not behave in a way that is conducive to the experimental setup or amenable to its plans and operations. Extreme tantrums alternate with lethargic phases. The sweets offered as rewards by the machines are chewed, but then used to smear the machines or block the coin slots. One of the children spends many sessions practicing climbing over the machines. Another uses the pinball machine first to repeatedly take a nap on it, and finally uses one of the coins to scratch the pinball machine so badly that it could no longer be played. If the behavior of the children does not match the predictions, the articles provide explanations that precisely cannot be derived from the data, such as a warm infection of the children or occasional accidental electric shocks from the devices. It does not even occur to the experimenters that the tantrums and refusals to work and the attempts to destroy the machines could have anything to do with the experiment itself. Rather, the effect that the children's tantrums and resistance diminished over time is proof to them that this behavior must be operant, that is reinforced by previous consequences from before the experimental phase and now successfully unlearned through the experiment. If the children behave in accordance with the experiment, that is, allow themselves to be controlled, this is proof to the experimenters that autistic children are also capable of learning and thus ultimately capable of being therapized. In this respect, what Etienne Jules Marais already stated for nature and its phenomena also applies to the behavior of the test subjects. It is to be forced, to quote Marais, by the devices to inscribe its beginning, duration, and end on paper and thus become visible, analyzable, and communicable. In short, to become an epistemic entity, data. As we also all know, and Lev Manovich put it, data do not just exist, they have to be generated. What emerges after this production process in the form of the aforementioned curves is, of course, by no means the unobstructed view of the phenomenon whose inscription it appears to be, but is itself extremely open to interpretation. On the one hand, epistemically, as Soraya de Chadaririan already emphasizes in view of the early graphic machines, I quote, "The universality of the phenomena is based on the negotiated standardization of a common experimental practice and the associated standardization of experience. It becomes a matter of course only for the participants of this very culture." End of quote. I would like to add that the informative value of the graphs tends towards zero without metadata, as the graphs of the self-writers are all similar. Whether what I have in front of me is the blood pressure data of a frog, the pecking behavior of a superstitious pigeon, or that of an autistic child on a sugar rush, cannot be determined under any circumstance on the basis of the graphs alone without this information. On the other hand, in terms of knowledge politics, the existence of the graphs does serve to validate the scientific nature of the methodology employed in the experiment and underscores the researchers' pursuit of knowledge in this field. As historians of science and technology, Bruno Strasser and Paul Edwards argue, to attach the label data to something is to place that thing specifically in the long chain of transformations that moves from nature to knowledge. This act of categorization marks a particular moment in time when someone thought some inscription or object could serve to ground a knowledge claim. In this respect, Förster and de Meyer had to get the maximum out of this elementary form of human-machine interaction, pressing a button or inserting a coin, in order to achieve a reliable, that is, visualizable data output. For Förster and de Meyer, the autistic child behavior, determined by the machines and recorded in the cumulative records, is then derived from the frequency with which the button is pressed and the coin is inserted. They represent the child's disposition to act, as they call it, whereby the level of motivation can be determined from the frequency of interaction. However, this alone has still no significance with regard to the autism of the behavior, which is Förster and de Meyer's first and foremost declared concern. Therefore, this measured behavior must be compared with the data of a control group of normal children. Förster declares, almost all of the characteristic performances of the autistic child may be observed in non-hospitalized children, but the main difference lies in the relative importance of each of these performances in terms of the total repertoire. Conversely, isolated instances of quite normal performances may be seen in the autistic child. Again, the relative frequency of the performances defines the autistic child. Autism, from the point of view of behaviorism, is therefore the relative frequency of normal behavior and can only be determined in purely quantitative terms and only as a comparative variable. Autistic behavior is therefore something that is simultaneously produced and defined by the behaviorist experiment, namely by interweaving and stabilizing apparatuses and theses and technologies in order to provoke and produce events. These events are not simply translated into data, as is so often said, but rather set as data. They are visualized in a certain way depending on the technological means of production, and these visualized data are subsequently subjected to analysis and interpretation. What comes to light here in this description of this production process is that not only the facticity and factuality of data can be doubted, but also that of behavior. Therefore, I would state, autistic behavior does not exist. It is neither inherent nor readily apparent. It necessitates a determination of what constitutes behavior in the first place, which is always contingent upon the available means of observation and recording. It necessitates the consistent enactment of this behavior, its transformation into data, and ultimately the analysis. This reductionist view of behavior continues to have far-reaching implications. At this juncture, even Faster and de Meyer did not market their experiment as therapy. In one of their papers, they expressed hope for future experiments to exhibit social behavior and for their established reward system to be extended and eventually replaced by social effects of the performances. Not even 5 years later, at UCLA, someone should try their hands at such an experiment. If you were in the United States between Christmas and New Year's Eve 1964 and wanted a little change from lighter entertainment, you could, for example, tune into one of the television programs of the National Education Television. The 6th episode of an international science magazine broadcast on December 27th, which was called Spectrum of all names, featured 2 reports. The first focused on research on the cognition of lower animal species. The second report provided insights into the work of the Neuropsychiatric Institute at UCLA. Under the title Child Psychiatry, Autism's Lonely Children, the approximately 20-minute feature reported on a pilot project at the Institute in which non-verbal autistic children were to learn to speak, read, and write. The principal investigator of the project was the principal of the children's school at the Institute, Dr. Frank Hewitt, who carried out his therapy with the help of a dark pivot box referred to as the teaching booth. An eye blink after Faster's and de Meyer's assessment experiment, human-machine interaction-based therapy was administered. And I'm going to show you a short clip of that television feature.
Dr. Frank Hewitt, who does research at the Institute, leads Marty into a teaching booth, a device for teaching him speech. Before he begins, the teacher must establish control over his pupil. To do this, he uses a variety of rewards and punishments to evoke simple responses.
So in this teaching booth, we can provide both pleasant, rewarding experiences for the child, as well as somewhat unpleasant experiences. For instance, when the child is cooperating and performing as the teacher directs, he may be given a piece of candy from this candy window. And should the child fail to cooperate, fail to pay attention while the teacher is working with him, he may be given a negative reinforcement, such as having the booth closed off and being separated from the teacher until he initiates contact by pushing a button on his side of the booth. Hi, Marty. Marty, that's right here. Good boy. Marty, that's right here.
First step in getting control over Marty was inducing him to imitate simple gestures on command, like clapping his hands.
Marty, clap your hands. Clap your hands. Marty, clap your hands. Clap your hands. Marty, clap your hands. Marty, clap your hands. Marty, clap your hands. Marty, good boy.
Dr. Hewitt rewarded him with candy only if he responded with the correct imitations.
Marty,
The candy encouraged Marty to repeat the gestures whenever he was cued.
touch my ear. Touch my ear. Touch my ear. Yeah, touch my ear. Come on. Marty, touch my ear. Come on. Marty, touch my ear. Marty, touch my ear. Good boy. Marty, touch your nose. Marty, touch your nose. Marty, touch your nose. Good boy. Marty, touch your nose. Touch your nose. Touch your nose. Touch your nose. Thank you. You don't like that candy.
It took 2 months to teach Marty these responses, but this was the first time his behavior had ever been effectively controlled. The next big step was to start him on the road to speech. Dr. Hewitt worked on one intelligible sound that Marty made spontaneously.
Beep, beep, beep. Beep, beep, beep. Marty.
By repeating the sound and offering him a candy reward, he hoped to train Marty to imitate him. He could then try to shape Marty's sound into a real word, but it did not work. If Marty would not vocalize for candy, would he speak up to avoid a punishment, like turning out the lights?
Good boy. Beep, beep, beep. Beep, beep, beep. Beep, 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 beep. 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 Good.
Finally, the candy worked too. Marty had taken a step toward acquiring speech.
Good boy.
So this literal black box, the teaching booth, was a multimedia immersive apparatus in host. Oui, je suis désolée. Est-ce que vous voulez que je vous explique un peu plus que ce qui est dit? Yeah? Ok.
Oh, merci. Sinon, on l'aura fait là, mais il n'y a pas de sous-titres là pour ce truc. On n'a pas eu le temps de...
So it was a multimedia immersive apparatus in whose choreographed interplay of its individual components and their modes of operation, the therapeutic process was realized. Frank Hewitt's bachelor degree in theater arts, which he completed before his postgraduate training, was probably an advantage in its development. The box, which appears to be a blend of a confessional and a puppet theater, is based on dramatic entrances and exits and a varietable, sophisticated stage machinery. This device for teaching speech, as it is called, is divided into 2 parts, as you could see, and fitted with a partition wall. One side is intended for the child undergoing therapy, while the therapist or teacher uses the other side. On the right-hand side of the partition wall, facing the child undergoing therapy, there's a small box made of transparent material, which can be operated from the therapist's side and is referred to as a candy window. The equipment also included a rotating chair on each side, a music player, a shelf, a small monitor, and a matching game. On the therapist's end, concealed from the child's view, there is a control panel equipped with electrical switches for operating the individual components. The top left-hand side of the partition wall is a room divider that could be moved up and down and is appropriately referred to as a shutter, as it effectively blocks out light. Light, as you could see, or rather its absence, plays a significant dramaturgical role in this enclosure. To initiate the therapy session, the child is instructed to operate a device located on the left wall of the box, as seen from their perspective. This device is a faintly lit button that emits a buzzing metallic sound. This serves as a signal to open the shutter, marking the commencement of therapy through the occurrence of light and contact with the therapist. However, the shutter's role in signaling the start of therapy is not its sole function. Instead, its purpose lies in the potential to darken the box and terminate the interaction by separating the child from the therapist. Consequently, it is an integral component of the therapeutic learning process. The therapist uses the option of punishment through darkness and isolation if the child does not cooperate during the therapy session. In the scene you just saw, this is the case when the child does not imitate the sound that you had asked him to mimic, BBB. Only after the shutter has been lowered, after some time, we hear the requested BBB from behind the black wall. This procedure is repeated twice more in the scene until the child undermines its logic by repeatedly leaning over the partition towards Hewitt and trying to buy his way out by kissing him. If the child does as it is told and conforms to Hewitt's imitation game, he is praised lavishly and rewarded with treats, in Marty's case not through the candy box, but fed directly into his mouth. The other elements of the box also served as rewards. In a later scene, another child, in addition to treats from the box, is rewarded for his correct answers with laps on the electric chair, short cartoons shown on the wall monitor, and children's songs through a loudspeaker. This is essentially a reward and punishment machine developed by Hewitt specifically for this learning therapy, I quote, in an effort to reduce extraneous stimuli to a minimum and to introduce negative reinforcement as a lever for establishment of control in order to counter the children's short attention span and because some of them could not be persuaded to participate by rewards alone. Hewitt finds inspiration for his method above all in animal experiments, as in Owen Mora's experiments and theories on bird speech learning. For Mora, the teacher plays a decisive role in his learning process, namely as the bird's love object, that is, as a positive reinforcer himself. Mora compares the role of the good teacher with the role of the good mother in the child's language development. He thus becomes the ultimate reinforcer, so to speak, which makes the separation from him in the case of Hewitt's shutter an even more effective punishment. The therapist is thus given an exceptionally important function. However, it is completely integrated into the machine logic of the total learning environment and ultimately becomes effective as one function among others. Neither Frank Hewitt's teaching booth made it to serial majority, nor did he or his apparatus make it into the annals of psychology. However, it would be inaccurate to label it a mere historical curiosity. In fact, Hewitt's study was far from unconventional. Its scientific approach, underlying assumptions, experimental environment, method of implementation, test subjects, and the experimenter's sense of mission all epitomize a paradigm of psychiatry that continues to enjoy global success to this day. Is behaviorism a revenant? A translation and continuation of these and other behaviorist techniques and logics can be found in today's digital cultures, in language learning, fasting, and fitness apps, as well as on commercial platforms, and wherever predictive analysis of behavior is the goal of efforts. Without having been sufficiently problematized to date, social robots used to diagnose and treat autism are probably the most uncompromising form of this phenomenon. Their diagnostic performance is often based on the principle of making statements based on sensor data using the interaction performance of the children in comparison with a peer group and applying the principles of operant conditioning. The concept of data behaviorism, introduced by Antoinette Rouvois in a critical examination of these techniques and logics, which has often been taken up to describe database behavior prediction as the explicitly new, the result of a profound change in our contemporary situation, obscures the fact that human-machine interaction, but above all the generation and analysis of data with the aim of behavior analysis, prediction and control, in conjunction with techno-solutionist efforts, have previously, or rather always, been the focus of behaviorist efforts. Felsters and de Meyer's experiments, the way in which they discuss its results and the conclusions they come to, show that behaviorism has always been data behaviorism, and that is widely received and much cited neologism as a pleonasm. Then as now, assumptions about autistic people are at the heart of the rationale, and autistic children in particular are the testing grounds for the development of these technologies. And even today, my studies of robot experiments show friction in the process. You can kiss robots on the head, but you can also simply knock them over. Merci beaucoup.